squadron.
The 336 group, and did it have 4 squadrons then?
Yes, there was the 478th, the 479th, the 480th, and the 481st.
And
our plane was assigned to a hard stand, which at that time we were unaware and soon later became aware was on the backside of the property of a family who had a young English lad who was admiring all the planes with his schoolmates, and he chose 131658 named Privy Donna as his plane. And many years after the war later, I found out about his selection process, and he told me the reason he picked our plane as his was because her letters of identification on the fuselage, RU for the Squadron 554th, and the letter A as the identification of the plane within that squadron. And having the letter A, he figured that that plane must have been the prima donna of the squadron.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I was the kid. I look older than him now, but that's how it goes. In 1942, I was a 14-year-old aeroplane mad schoolboy, and I saw my first B-26 one October afternoon in 1942, flying sedately along at about 5,000 feet. I wasn't very impressed, except that it was a new spotting first to my list of aircraft. It was probably an airplane of the 319th Bomb Group, which was shortly off to North Africa. I didn't see another B-26 until the following March of 1943. I remember exactly where I was, walking along a country road to catch a bus, and suddenly, about a mile away, skimming across the treetops, was a B-26. And in the next few weeks, almost every day we would see B-26s flying low over the countryside, brushing the treetops almost, skipping across the fields. It was wonderful for we mad boys. We'd rush outside at the sound of those right pats, and sure enough, we'd see these Marauders flash by. We knew them as the ERs and DRs, the identification letters on the fuselage. We didn't know that they were the 450th and 452nd bomb squadrons, which would shortly take place in one of the most fateful Marauder missions of all time. But then in the middle of May 1943, the Marauders stopped skipping across the countryside over the treetops. They started to fly in formations sedately, more or less imitating their big brothers, the B-17s, and I lost interest. Well, until one day in June 1943, I was in my class at school. It was a scripture lesson. The headmaster was taking the class, and suddenly there was a familiar Pratt & Whitney sound. But at first, nothing to see, and then suddenly, curving round outside the classroom window, was this B-26 with its gear down. And that meant that the airfield beside my old man's farm was being occupied by Marauders. I was so excited, but the headmaster wasn't. I remember his words, "Freeman, will you attend? There are young men up there who are paid to look after those machines, and they don't need your help." That day when I got home, got off the school bus, got on my cycle, cycled up to the airfield, and sure enough, there were B-26s parked all along beside the public road. And there were a host of other youngsters like myself there. They were much braver. They forced a gap through the hedge, but I followed, and we surrounded a B-26. The guard didn't know quite what to do with this invasion by 20 young British boys, but eventually he drove us off. But not before we touched the machine, actually touched it. It was wonderful. And that was called Sad Ass. That was the name on this particular B-26. But it was a sad story because it disappeared after a few days, and it wasn't until long after the war I learned that it had been shot down and its pilot had been awarded your second highest award for bravery, DSC. But in the weeks following the arrival of the B-26s, we boys were always, when we were out of school, up and down that road, writing down the nicknames, writing down the numbers. I have to confess that I learned more about female anatomy from the paintings on those. But We each had our favorite plane. My younger brother had one called Blazing Heat. Friends had one called Honey Child, Our Baby, and so on. And mine was the Privy Donna, which, as you just heard, was RUA. And I used to count the bombs as they were added for the missions. Wonderful days to us. We didn't appreciate that the young men who flew them had their lives on the line. It wasn't all that wonderful for them. But the most wonderful thing of all was to sit at the end of the runway and watch the B-26s come and go. Nothing comes into land like a B-26. Other aeroplanes used to float into land, but a B-26, it seemed the pilot was intent on diving right into the end of the runway, and at the last minute, he would pull up and grease it down with a little familiar puff of blue smoke. Wonderful days. And then one day, they were all gone. They were moved. We never forgave the Air Force for moving them. We felt that a cardinal sin had been committed. Anyway, there were still plenty of Marauders to see flying around in formation because Essex County in 1944, in the spring of 44, had more B-26s than anywhere else in the world. And wonderful days for us. And then they moved to France and we didn't see any more B-26s, but at the end of the war, several came back to visit us. Some of those that had come up from North Africa, the 17th and 320th bomb groups, would have been seen on our local field. An old rat poisoned a B-26, which had operated 2 years before. And then the war was over and Marauders were gone. But today, those kids like me are, you know, crumblies, we call ourselves in England. We're beginning to crumble, pensioners. But if you mention the word Marauder to those chaps, you see a sort of mellow look come into their eye, the sort of look that a man has when you mention a girlfriend he loved years ago, and that's how it was. One of the other young men in those days, somewhat younger than myself and a better looking guy, will now tell you his memories.
How do you follow that? My memories are somewhat different to Roger's, and I'm not going to walk down the same path that he's just trod. In a war, youngsters like myself really don't understand or appreciate the seriousness of what is actually going on. And I suppose it was all a big wheeze as far as we were concerned, until we started to get bombed. Now that was slightly different. It was great fun picking up the shrapnel and the bits and pieces that were lying about. But the one vivid memory that I have and often repeat is, during one air raid, crouching underneath the kitchen table, listening to the bombers go overhead, and hearing and vividly remembering the bomb that killed my best friend. Then I knew we were in a war. But like most things, as a youngster, you keep the memory, but you don't keep the grief. And as the war went on, we suddenly started to notice some strange people. God, their uniforms were smart. They talked differently. We couldn't understand them most of the time. Perhaps that was a good thing. But we soon learned how to tap their marvelous resources. And it was easily done, and I know that you chaps realized how you fell for it. Gunny gun chum. If you were appropriately attired, in other words, your sweater had got holes in the elbows, your socks around your ankles, your face was a little bit grubby and your cap wasn't on straight, and with a wistful pair of eyes you looked up this yank and you said, "Hey, gunny gum chum," you were on a winner. You got it every time. So yes, we sussed you. I hope you didn't suss us. They were great days in many ways. And as I said, we didn't realize the pain that was going on elsewhere. But like Roger, we noticed a new shape in the sky, a shape that was with us for but a short time in reality, but a shape that never went out of my mind. And it is that shape allied and associated with the people who took it into battle, that has me standing here today, with all the people sitting in this audience, at what will be this week the culmination of a momentous occasion as far as we are concerned, the dedication of an archive that will in perpetuity remember the B-26, but more importantly, you. The story that we have told in the first session skipped over a lot of things. In this middle session, we'll touch on some of the peripheral matters. The 22nd had young but relatively experienced air and ground crews to go along with older competent regulars, all of whom took the B-26 in stride.
I was in the 18th Reconnaissance Squadron at the time. It was later designated the 408th after we got in the war. But in the interim period after we picked up our B-26s, we were in effect a sort of training squadron that checked out a lot of B-26 pilots from other bases around. I remember one of my students was General Doolittle's son.
Lieutenant Mike Michaelis came out and says, "Let me introduce you to your new airplane." And there, sitting on the ramp was, along with many others, was an old clip-wing B-26 with a tail number 13. And we crawled up in the cockpit, and Mike says, "Now here's the way you start it." And he showed me the procedure for starting the airplane. A brand new co-pilot was assigned, and he says, "There's 2 or 3 things you should remember about the airplane. One, it's all electric. So if you have trouble on takeoff, you must throw this switch and this switch and do this and do that. Your approach speed should not be under 150 miles an hour. So go fly." And we did. Well, that was an experience. We went around the traffic pattern, and the airplane didn't fly like the B-25 flew. It had a way of flying all of its own. And we came in at 150 miles an hour, so a lot of speed. And we couldn't hold the altitude on the final approach like you would in a B-25. And just by a lot of good luck, we got over some trees and on the ground, and then we decided we'd better start checking this airplane out and find out just what makes it run.
Walter Krell will tell you how he learned.
The day came that I woke Dick Sanders up early in the morning. I said, "I want to get checked out in the airplane." Well, he said, "Fine." He says, "You probably got 10 hours in it as a co-pilot." He said, "You don't know any more about it than we do." But he said, "I'll check you out." So he takes me up and we fly around the field. We land. He says, "You're checked out." And I said, "Now I want to go flying." So I looked around for a co-pilot, and I found Tad Ford, who was a real rough and ready guy, and he turned out to be one terrific combat pilot over in the Pacific. But he and I got in the B-26, and we looked at each other and said, "Aren't we supposed to have an engineer?" And I said, "Well, maybe we are." Now, there'd been a guy out there that we'd seen wheeling around wheel jacks and messing around the ramp and the line as a mechanic, and his name was Ducky. So we ran up to this guy and we said, "Hey, Ducky, will you fly with us? You probably understand all about the airplane and what's supposed to go on in the back there." So he grunted a couple of times, and we all got in the airplane and took off. And we went to take off, and the airplane just wasn't behaving normally. It wouldn't grab speed. It didn't seem to have any lift. So I got the thing stopped, and we taxied back, and I asked Tad, "What did we do wrong?" He says, "I don't know." He said, "It looked all right to me." Well, I said, "We won't even know what to tell anybody." He says, "No." I said, "Well, we better do it again and get it off the ground." This time, we went like mad, and we got it off the ground, and both props ran away, and they were winding up. If you remember that B-26, what did we have, 2450 on takeoff, 2375, 2400, and here we're winding up with 3,000 RPMs, 31, 32, 33, and getting worse all the time. The noise was unbelievable, even with our earphones on. And it wasn't flying, it was mushing and stalling. And I made a series of flat turns. I got it up to about 400 or 500 feet and made a series of flat turns and went on my downwind and got another flat turn and dumped it in. I'll remember in my downwind, I saw guys pouring out of the hangars, guys pouring out of the officers' club, guys pouring out of offices and looking up. The racket must have been terrible down there. So we dumped it in and taxied it back and got out of the airplane and looked at each other. So what'd we do wrong? About that time, a colonel, either Colonel Gillespie or Colonel Gilkey, came up, and he said, "You didn't have your." He peers up in the wheel well and looks at the electrical panel behind the navigator, and he said, "You didn't even have the generators turned on." I looked at Tad Ford and said, "Anybody ever tell you about the generators?" He says, "Nobody ever did." So we got a little bawling out, and fine, we're back in the ground. And then Tad Ford and I looked at each other and we said, "Well, what's the matter with this guy Ducky? He's supposed to know all about that. He's a mechanic around here, isn't he?" So we crawled up into the airplane, and here's this guy Ducky sitting there looking straight ahead. He'd been sitting in there ever since we've been on the ground and just staring right straight ahead. We started to talk to him and he didn't answer, so we nudged him a little bit and he let out a grunt. So Tad and I looked at each other and we said, well, maybe the guy's getting over it. But what happened was we forgot about it. About 2 weeks later, I asked a mechanic on the line, "Where's Ducky? I haven't seen him around lately." And the guy said, "Well, he's still in the bug house." I was the first one to take our squadron commander, Major Dave Lawback, for riding the airplane. And he was a very bright fellow. He'd written a navigation manual for the Air Corps, and he was a first-class squadron commander. And he goes up in this airplane and he gets in the pilot's seat and he flies it on instruments for a while and he puts it through what he feels his paces are. And when we got on the ground, all the way in from the parking ramp to the operations office, he kept shaking his head saying, "That's a young man's airplane. That's a young man's airplane."
Phil Tenner had an entirely different experience. Phil.
After listening to these two gentlemen talk about their experience as children, that's a pretty hard act to follow. How's this? And April 1942 found me with secret orders to proceed without delay to the Martin Aircraft Plant in Essex, Maryland, and from there to Cairo, Egypt. I later learned I received this assignment because I was described by my commanding officer as a qualified twin-engine pilot. What a joke. I had been assigned to the 128th Observation Squadron at Lawson Field, Georgia. This was a federalized Georgia National Guard squadron with little to do except fly Cubs and drop flour bombs on tanks which were in training at Fort Benning. I discovered two Curtiss Wright twin-engine A-18s on the field that no one was flying, and self-taught myself to fly them. That is by putting on a parachute, taxiing up and down the runway, tacking up and down the runway, and finally one day just taking off. The 6.5 hours I built up is what qualified me. Okay. I didn't know then that it was a precursor to how I was going to learn to fly most of the 43 aircraft I was checked out in when I left the service. I was at Martin Aircraft along with two other pilots and a number of engine, propeller, radio, and other specialists, all assigned to learn all about the Baltimore. A-30. and then proceed to Cairo, Egypt, where we would then impart our knowledge and skills to the RAF, which had purchased 400 of the aircraft from Martin, and we were part of the contract. We had a 2-week wait for our particular aircraft to come off the line, and again, with nothing else to do, I sort of hung around the operations offices where the U.S. Air Corps pilots were testing B-26As for acceptance by the U.S. military. I noticed that they flew without co-pilots and asked if I could go along in that capacity. They welcomed me with open arms, and I was soon introduced to sweating white-knuckle flying, which I soon learned was the trademark of all those who flew those first B-26s. I probably had about 15 hours as a co-pilot and about a half a dozen landings before I had to concentrate my efforts on the A-30. When we checked in with the RAF in Cairo, we soon learned that they had been flying the A-30 in combat for about 6 months and certainly knew more about it than we did. I had 29 and a half hours. Our orders were signed by General Hap Arnold, and they were for a 90-day assignment to the RAF, which meant they had to find an assignment for us. I went to an RAF test squadron at Kasferit, Egypt, which was on the Bitter Lake, a part of the Suez Canal waterway. The job of this squadron was to test fly aircraft which had been repaired or overhauled, and this could include anything from a Hurricane or a Spitfire to a Mosquito or Sterling heavy bomber. Most of the RAF pilots were heroes of the Battle of Britain, and to them this work was a piece of cake. To check me out in an aircraft I had never flown, they would sit me in it, tell me that's where all the tits and knobs are, and if you get in trouble, old man, just look it up in the G file. Okay. It was this base I met Lieutenant Colonel Flint Garrison, who was over in the theater instructing the RAF in the use of the B-26. I understand now that it was Squadron 14, but at the time I had no clue as to what he was doing. He would be gone for 3 or 4 days, and then he would be back. I entered his life because he really didn't like flying the B-26 around, except when he absolutely had to, and asked me if I knew how to fly an A-20. And if I did, would I fly him around when he wanted to go to Cairo for R&R or wherever else he wanted to go. Okay, the deal was that in return, he would check me out in the B-26. When I flew him around, his instructions to me were to get high enough to take off so that I could make a turn and stay below 50 feet. We chased a lot of camels off the road on the way to Cairo, and then had to climb the 500 feet to get into the traffic-patterned Heliopolis Airport in Cairo. I did my part, and he gave me a letter indicating I was a qualified B-26 pilot. My last memory of Flint Garrison is a picture of him at the bar each night trying to calm his nerves at the end of each exhausting day of instruction. After a while, Flint and I drifted apart. Where he went, I don't know, but I continued at Kasferit until assigned back to the States.
Slowly, the powers that be came to realize that they had a different bird here that would require a more complete introduction than these men were getting. With this in mind, General Arnold sent George Mundy to Tarrant.
I had flown the B-26 at Eglin Field, and I had mentioned to General Luke Smith that I liked the airplane very much. I thought it was a wonderful airplane. And he remembered this in the back of his mind, apparently, at a staff meeting with General Arnold, who was very upset over the bad reputation that the B-26 was getting. And General Smith volunteered me to go down and take over the situation in the training command, which I did. I got down to Fort Worth and found a very deplorable situation. All the aircraft had been grounded due to fuel leaks that had been serviced with the wrong type fuel, and that there were 2 classes backed up and who were getting a little leery of the airplane. I called the factory at Omaha and got 3 new airplanes sent down. And General Arnold was to inspect the flying school. I went down on a Wednesday, and General Arnold was to inspect the flying school Saturday. Well, by Saturday, we had 3 B-26s making touch-and-go landings, which is touch-and-go landing with a B-26, I think, is a little unusual, but we were making a good display for General Arnold, and we weren't too concerned with the fact that there was an unusual procedure for the B-26. From this was at Tarrant Field in Fort Worth, Texas, and it was also the home of a B-24 flying training unit, and it was pretty crowded there, and we had to move as soon as we could, which we did to Del Rio, Texas. The base at Del Rio was being built as a bombardier training base, and it got diverted to the B-26 program due to the emergency that General Arnold put on the program.
Max Hammond was an instructor pilot at Del Rio. Max.
Well, General Mundy was out of the class of 28, and as he said, he was sent to Fort Worth to try to bring the aircraft under a little better control. About 12 to 15 of us that had been advanced flying school instructors with about 1,000 hours apiece were assembled at Fort Worth to be B-26 instructors. None of us had wanted to be instructing cadets forever, and periodically, of course, sign-up sheets would come by, and out of frustration, I signed up for B-26s, little knowing that I was just going to be an instructor, only at a little higher level. After about 2 to 3 weeks at Fort Worth, most of it spent in a motel, I think, and a couple trips around the pattern, we were anointed as B-26 instructors, and we became the initial cadre at Del Rio, Texas. The transition school was to introduce the student to the combat aircraft. All aspects of flying except practice bomb runs with the combat crews. Our students all graduated as first pilots. Instructors like myself, of course, feel a little bit like a high school football coach might feel that has a chance to listen to his proteges, the stars in the major leagues, talk about their experiences in the professional ranks. Our hat is off, of course, to those who flew the airplane in combat. There are a number of fine things about Del Rio. One that was nearly autonomous. Higher headquarters didn't know much about the airplane, so they left us pretty much alone. Of course, there was the urgency of the program. General Mundy, Colonel Mundy at that time, was a very good commander. Our people generally were very well qualified. The townspeople were great to us, and we all loved the aircraft. At Del Rio, we initiated a pre-flight check that became standard for the airplane throughout the Air Corps. We had to send many times our students and instructors out for a week at a time to look for gasoline. We didn't have enough gasoline at Del Rio. Several of our students, of course, became very famous. I remember Lou Clay, who became a 4-star general, and we had the West Point classes of 42 and 43. We were on a 7-day-a-week schedule, of course. It was arduous but necessary. We felt it was quite a bonus when Martin came out and lengthened the wing on the airplane. Some of our best instructors we found were former basic flying school instructors. We trained hundreds of students in 5-week courses, and of course cadres for the 2 other transition schools, the one at Dodge City, Kansas, and at Frederick, Oklahoma. Some of you, particularly combat pilots, might think that the B-26 instructor's job was like guarding the Civil War cannon in the town square. However, it wasn't quite as dull all the time as a chess game in the firehouse. We did have some excitements from time to time, and oftentimes we thought our instructors were going to keep us from ever getting to combat. In mid to late 1943, the second transition school was set up at Dodge City. We in the Training Command are honored to be here today to represent the transition schools and to salute those of you that fought with this great aircraft.
And then they sent me to Dodge City, where I opened up a B-26 school. And I think when I finally got there, we had about 80 short-winged B-26s there, and nobody flying them. And they lost more people in training in the United States than was considered safe. So that's why they set up these so-called advanced flying schools for the heavier combat airplanes like the B-26. You could go right from the regular flying schools into the four-engine airplanes like the B-17 because they were a less complicated airplane to fly than the B-26 was. B-26 was a demanding airplane. It flew and glided and landed about the same speed. Nobody down headquarters knew anything about them, and they didn't want any part of them. Just keep those things flying and don't tell us what the problems are. So if we didn't cure it up there, see, it wasn't like the higher headquarters. They want to come down and tell you how to do everything. You do it. Well, I had Frenchmen there at the same time. Frenchmen gave me more problems than the Wasp did.
Right. Well, I guess we've all heard that hackneyed old story about the macho Air Force type who sees a B-26 come in and make a superb landing, and he says, "Boy, that's a man's airplane," and a pretty girl gets out. Not my story, I assure you. Anyway, there were two classes of Wasps were transitioned in the B-26 at Dodge, and one of those attending was Edna M. Davis. Edna.
I have to deviate from what I have written here and to tell you about my past and hope future, is that listening to all this, I was always sort of self-important. I flew the B-26. Oh, wasn't that wonderful? Looking today and realizing all of you and what you all did, I really stand before you humble and pay homage to you all. We had a very small part, which I'd like to tell you about. All hell broke loose. It was a beautiful, quiet morning for a tow target run over the Gulf of Mexico out of Harlingen Air Force Base. Our target was out, the B-24 was in position, filled with gunners. Every gun was manned. And there we were, and all of a sudden, pandemonium broke loose. 50 caliber machine gun bullets were sailing into the airplane, zizzing by the airplane. The B-24 pulled a 9 o'clock low, I pulled a high right, and everybody was screaming, and I was very busy, and I couldn't scream. But anyway, what happened was that the B-24 was overfull of Chinese gunners. No English, no interpreter. The only thing they knew was to hit and fire the airplane and hit the airplane with the 50 calibers. 10 guns were aimed at us as we made our passes. Fortunately, we came down, no one was hurt. We were filled with holes. The horizontal stabilizer on the right, the vertical stabilizer on the right was pretty badly damaged, but nothing happened. As an aside, the pilot who saved our lives by pulling away so quickly, I married, and we have been married 50 years today. So we thank you. So now you wonder how in the world I ever got myself in that predicament. But all my life I had dreamed to fly, and my father had bought an old World War I Jenny after the war, which I flew as a child, and we finally ditched in Lake Erie. At the University of California at Berkeley, where I majored in society and fun and games and political science. And the war was coming on. The university offered the CPT course, which is Civilian Pilot Training course. I was first in line in the door to sign up. And they took one look at me and said, "You're a woman, go, no women." And I was pretty incensed and pretty upset. But ultimately, at Mills College, which is in Oakland, nearby Berkeley, they did have the only women's college CPT course. And they couldn't fill their quota, so they called and asked if I would do it, and I was thrilled to death. So I finally graduated in February with a BA degree and a prized private pilot license. Right after that, in March, I joined the WASP in Sweetwater, Texas. My class was 43W5, which meant we were the 5th class to go through the WASP training. However, we were the very first class in the Sweetwater Avenger Field base. They were still then training men at the base, which was a lot of fun, which lasted maybe 3 or 4 weeks before they moved them all out. There we flew the PT-19, the BT-13, the A-6, and the AT-6, and the A-17. After that, I went to the Ferry Command at Dallas. And on my last trip to Long Beach, General Arnold and Jackie Cochran took me by the collar and explained to me that I was to go to a B-26 transition at Dodge City. I couldn't have been more thrilled. The reasoning they had behind them was really the reputation of the B-26 was in such low esteem that they wanted to embarrass all the men and everybody else in the world and show that these women, they can fly anything. We didn't care what it was, we just wanted to fly. But Dodge City was winter, and it was freezing, and it was cold, and there were tar paper shacks, and we had potbelly stoves. We had no uniforms. All we wore was pinks and the shirts of you men, and A2 jackets, and any flying equipment was a hand-me-down from the men. I never in my life had a parachute that even remotely fit. My first instructor, maybe some of you remember, was Lieutenant Skapansky, I think it was. He was the most handsome man. I could hardly take my eyes off the 26 before looking at him. We did fly the short wings. When we went in, we all learned to fly the short wings and ultimately went to the longer ring variety. Early one morning, I remember particularly, I was told by operations to go out and get in my airplane that I was going to fly first pilot. I was just absolutely undone. I was so excited. So I went out in my airplane and I got ready. And then I got ready. And then I got more ready. And nobody showed up. I had no engineer. I had no radio man. I had no co-pilot. And so I didn't know. And the tower was calling and saying, get your airplane in the air. So I went back into operations. And I said, look what's happening. So it took Colonel Oldfield, who was in charge of the base at that time, to come down and threaten court-martial. If not, in 10 minutes, that crew was not aboard the airplane. So a little humiliated and still very thrilled, we took off. And attitudes changed immeasurably almost overnight. And it wasn't that I was the first female pilot to solo the B-26. But in all humility, I'll have to say it wasn't that I was any better pilot than anybody else. I was simply the first one ready. There had been a competition between the instructors to get their female pilot out there first. So there was a lot of impetus behind. I'm skipping here because I was only given a few minutes. There was, I have to tell you about a cross country at night that we do. Now, it's no secret how convenient men's equipment suits the relief tube. It's a little different for women, particularly when it's freezing, freezing cold. You're at 9,000 feet. You've got every piece of fleece-lined, heavy, heavy leather equipment on you possibly can. So I very quietly, when it wasn't my turn to fly, tippy-toed back to the rear of the airplane. And I managed to fill 2 Dixie cups. And I managed to get me all put back together, and I managed to tippy-toe back up to the front to pour them in the relief tube. But I get midway, and all of a sudden, whoosh, the bomb bay doors open. And the catwalk is like this wide, you know, and I'm standing there like this, and I'm looking down like that, so I went, shh, that's my... That was my only experience in bombing, and then I listened to all of you, and I think, oh, God. The crew thought it was hilarious, and I was really kind of dubious about it. But anyway, of the 16 girls that went to Dodge City, 12 of us graduated. And 8 of us were sent to Harlingen for gunnery school and tow targets. And after my initial experience of not having a crew go with it was very flattering, because all of the crews that had trained with us at Dodge City, almost to a man, asked please to be transferred with us to our other bases, and particularly to Harlingen. And towing targets in South Texas in the B-26 was a joyride. We had a ball. It was wonderful. We alternated co-pilot and pilot with our co-pilot, our other counterpart women. So we were a women crew throughout the rest of the time. We had a male crew, however. We had 2-hour runs for the 26 and 4-hour runs for the 24s. And hence I had time, so I flew everything that flew on the base. I checked out in the P-39, the P-63, the P-51, the B-25, and the C-47. And I even flew an old Hudson, if you remember that old baby. When we first arrived, we had no quarters. There were only 8 of us, and they didn't know what to do with us in Harlingen. So they put us in the main street in downtown Harlingen, which was a little bitty town. And right in the middle of the town was a 2-story building, and we were billeted over a paint store. You had a little stair, and you went up. The favorite thing for the men at Harlingen to do was to send their innocents in to knock on our door. I hope I don't have to explain that. And much to their embarrassment, we made a lot of good friends that way anyway. Let's see. But anyway, you have to realize that we were 8 women among 3,500 men on the base. So now I have to come back to some pertinent points which I was asked to cover. First of all, we only had one thing in our hearts, and that was to fly. We would have done it for free. We had to prove that we could and did excel in all facets of service, no questions of the difficulty or problems. We were promised military status when we came in, but with the help of a negative military and a negative Drew Pierce, a negative everything, it was not granted, and we were taken in on civil service. We were known as Jackie Cochran's glamour girls, which couldn't have been less the truth. We even had to face sabotage, sugar in the gas tank, a cut rudder cable. It was very hush-hush because we didn't want to stir up any trouble, because we wanted to be militarized. It did not happen. We just quietly went about our job so that we could release all of you nice fellows to go over there and shoot up the world and win the war for us, which we enjoyed doing. We even completed officers' training service because we wanted to be ready when we were militarized. Our status was that of officers, although we were civil service. In 1970, the Air Force announced that they would take women into the Air Force Academy as being pilots, and everybody said, yay, that's women's lib, isn't this wonderful? And we all stood there and said, hey, wait a minute, where have we been all this time? In 1942, just for some statistics to sort of give you the overall picture, in 1942 and 43, the Air Corps received 25,000 applications to join the WASP and the Air Force. We trained 1,830. 1,074 got their wings and flew in all kinds of aircraft, test flying, tow targets, trainers, transport, instruments, anything you could think of, we did. With the war winding down and you men returning from Europe to take our places, we were deactivated in December of 1945. 38 women died in service, where again the Air Corps and the Civil Service and the government let us down. We had to take up collections to send our own girls back home and get them buried. We were allowed no gold stars in the windows. We flew over 60 million miles, from Pipers to B-29s. And with over 400 hours of ground school and training, we acquired the equivalent of a degree in aeronautics. With heavy pressure from General Arnold's son and Barry Goldwater and the WASPs, Congress finally passed our bill to make us part of the service in 1977. We received honorable discharges, we were sent ribbons, we're even told we could use the VA hospitals if necessary, and they'd bury us. I came out a captain. But still, we were pleased, and at last, we were one of you. Our war was disastrous. It was a bloody affair, but as a nation, we stood together. And from our WASP point of view, and as women in a man's world, we benefit from our living during, I call it the era of ethics, or the ethics of the era, because never, not one disrespectful situation did I encounter. There was often the question of how I was to be addressed or treated. But like, do I salute? Do I not salute? But always with respect. And we never doubted our reception anywhere we went. Even from the macho man, we knew we had earned our place. And we loved our place, and we loved to fly. We stood tall, and to this day we are proud, and we're proud of all of you. There is an old Gullis, and we've made it to this day to celebrate our 50th. That's some doing. There's an old Gullah expression in the South Carolina Low Country. It says, as long as you got your feet moving, you can go. Age don't get it. It's the way you carry yourself. Cheers.
Well, the gals certainly have it, don't they? Well, you all know what a representative is. And there were representatives not only for Martin, but such others as Curtis and Pratt and Whitney. A rep who covered lots of territory for Martin was Mel Taylor. Come on, Mel.
Well, that's a hard act to follow. I'll tell you. I'm happy to be here, as you might imagine. I started with the Glen L. Martin Company in 1939, June 39, and I started out working on the 167, which was the Maryland for the French Air Force, and then the 187, the Baltimore for the British Air Force, before being assigned to the B-26. Once I was assigned to the B-26, I worked in what they called final test on the airplane in the manufacturing area, not the flight test. And I was responsible for checking out all the systems to make sure they functioned properly. After about a year of doing this in the factory, they asked me if I would go to the field and assist out at Patterson Field with the accelerated service test, which I did. And there was a Colonel Gilkey, Colonel Gillespie, some crews from the 22nd Bomb Group that were flying the airplane. Excuse me. And we had our share of problems. The runaway props, the nose gear collapsing, the meringue fuel cells swelling, and problems with the fuel discharge nozzle. And so we had a whole series of problems there, which made it a very exciting time. But we were there to help solve these problems. And we were in direct contact with the company and the engineers, and they would come out from time to time to assist in the solution. Then they would go back and design changes, and we would install these modification kits to correct these problems. The other thing that happened while I was there is the Russians came in, and they were going to evaluate the B-26. And there was a group of, as I recall, some 25 or 30 people, and a Russian general, and they flew the airplane, put it through its paces, and the general was like a hotshot pilot. He'd take off. Before he got to the end of the runway, he was in a 30 or 40 degree bank trying to pull up, and it was kind of interesting. So the other thing I did is that they provided an interpreter, and I was teaching the pilots and the technicians the electrical system on the airplane. The other thing that occurred there was General Doolittle came in. He wasn't a general then. And he was evaluating the B-26 for carrier suitability test. And I think the General Doolittle really liked the B-26, but he didn't think he could get it off a carrier. But let me tell you, he really tried. He'd stand on the brakes and rev that thing up, 2,600 RPM, and have that thing bouncing before he let it go. But he still couldn't get it off in a short enough distance. One of the incidents that occurred at Patterson Field while I was there, some of you may remember, and I think it happened to the 38th Bomb Group, and that is as you all know, is a sod field. And so this airplane is going down the field to take off, and the sun visor, remember the sun visor? It fell down, and the pilot reached up to raise the sun visor out of his line of sight, and the co-pilot, who had instructions to get the gear up as soon as you can, he reaches over, grabs the lever, and pulls the gear up. Of course, the airplane, not being ready to fly, just settled down onto the sod field, which is kind of embarrassing. Anyhow, there was a Master Sergeant Fred Dame with the 38th Bomb Group, and he came up with a little mechanical device. Some of you may remember it. That was attached to the aft side of the console by the landing gear lever that you had to cock before you could move the lever up. And that was done by Master Sergeant Dame. And I think the 38th Group equipped all their airplanes with that. Anyhow, from Patterson Field, Colonel Lewis and the 38th Bomb Group was there. The 22nd Group left. The 38th Group split up, as you know. The 69th and 70th went to the Pacific. The other two squadrons went off to form, I guess, groups at Barksdale and MacDill. Anyhow, I was reassigned to Barksdale Field and to work with the 335th Replacement Training Unit, and Colonel Lewis was there. And so we assisted them in setting up their training programs. We were using Class 26 airplanes for training, parts off of airplanes to build mock-ups for training the people. And it was a pretty interesting time down there. And I was there until, April 1943. Colonel Lewis was reassigned. He went over to the 3rd Bomb Wing, which was over in Europe. And so I got reassigned to go to Europe. And so I moved over to the 3rd Bomb Wing, which shortly became the 9th Bomber Command. Pardon me. Anyhow, so I was staying with the 9th Bomber Command at Marks Hall in England. And as more and more groups came over, I had the responsibility of sort of coordinating the activities with those bomb groups, the 9th Bomber Command, and also the Martin Company. And so it meant a lot of traveling around England. Saw a lot of interesting things in England. After the invasion, I was assigned to the 98th Combat Wing. And this was the first wing to go to Europe or to France. And so we moved down to Southampton to wait, because I wasn't going to fly over. I had a little English car. And so I take this little English car and we load it on an LST. And we go over and I land at Omaha Beach. And interestingly enough, we laid at anchor for 3 days after a rough crossing. And while we laid at anchor and during the crossing, my little car got soaked. And as you can well imagine, sitting up in the bow of this thing with the clamshells. When it come time to unload the ship, it was a very steep ramp and I couldn't get the car started. So the GIs were anxious to get the rest of the vehicles off this LST. So they pushed me down this ramp, and here I'm trying to get it started, going down the ramp, and it wouldn't start. So what happened then was they took a tank, which they were using for a tracked vehicle on the beach. This was about 6 weeks after D-Day. There was a tank as a tracked vehicle, and they take this huge chain and hook to my front bumper and figure they're going to, tow me out of the way. And so they give them the signal to move the thing. They start to pull it away, and there goes my front bumper. So then they get the shovels and they dig down, and this car I had, a little Hillman 10, had a transverse axle on the thing. So they dig down underneath. They take this big chain and hook onto the axle. And I says, oh crap, here goes the whole front end. So, but anyhow, they hook it up to the thing. It plows a furrow, with my car, this big heavy chain hanging down. And the GI jumps down off of this tank to unhook the chain. I says, hey, you have to keep towing me till I get this started, because I got to join this convoy. So here's this huge tank with a big chain dragging the ground, an anchor chain, and this little English car running up and down Omaha Beach. But I finally did get it started. And that was my introduction to Europe. The roads were pretty bad, but we spent most of our time with the bomb groups in the 98th Combat Wing, and we were pretty much attached to the 323rd, for subsistence and things. And we moved from, we stayed at Lassay, lived in tents, and then we moved up after Paris fell. We moved up to Chartres and then to Lyon. And we were headquartered in a building that was a hunting lodge for Louis XIV, and it was pretty nice. We stayed there until the Battle of the Bulge, and they moved us back to the Beauvais-Tille, which is a facility outside of Paris. But I spent a lot of time coordinating activities. I used to get to Langford Lodge up in Ireland, where they had an overhaul depot, Stansted, where they had spare and repair parts, because there was always a shortage of repair parts. The other thing that I got involved in, losing my voice, other thing I got involved with is the first French Air Force was down at Dijon. And so they had requested some technical assistance, and another tech rep, Jimmy Hudson, and I went down there and spent a week with the French Air Force. So that's sort of my experience with the 26th. All the time that I was with the 26th in the field was with Colonel Lewis, and I'd like to give him some credit because I think he had a lot to do with helping us survive the Truman Committee, as well as the survival of the B-26, or the success of the B-26. The other thing I'd like to say in closing is that I think the Glenn Martin Company built a damn good airplane, but I think the air crews and ground crews, you guys here and gals, made it a great one. Thank you.
Besides building the B-26, Martin built components that were used in other combat aircraft. The top gun turret, which Martin designed and built in a very short time, was both used in the B-17, the B-24, and the B-25. Another first for Martin engineering was the self-sealing fuel cell, which was used in many other airplanes. Robert Lamont was involved with a very special order for these cells. Robert.
In December 1937, G.L. Martin was issued a patent for building the first meringue fuel cell at its Middle River plant in Baltimore, Maryland. In 1940, Martin granted exclusive rights to 5 U.S. rubber plants to manufacture the meringue cells. Mishawaka was a flagship plant for all accountability of quality control, manufacturing, testing, and sales. Let's define the word meringue. Where did that come from? You won't find it in the dictionary. Martin coined the word using the first 3 letters of Martin, M-A-R, and the first 3 letters of engineering, E-N-G. Thus the word M-A-R-E-N-G, meringue. The meringue cell was designed to replace expensive metal fuel tanks. There were 2 types: the meringue bladder cells used in commercial operations, and the meringue self-sealing cells used in combat. The combat cells had 3 additional layers of rubber. The cells were designed to hold 100-octane fuel for long periods of time without contaminating fuel. They had to withstand temperatures of minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit to plus 160 degrees Fahrenheit. They had to be lightweight, crash resistant, and withstand all operational shocks and stresses. In the combat cells, a 50 caliber bullet puncture had to seal in 2 minutes. These meringue self-sealing cells were installed in many B-26 Marauder airplanes. In January 1942, the Mishawaka plant received hand-carried orders from Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle to build 24 sets of auxiliary fuel cells for the B-25 airplane. The delivery date was firm with no extensions. I supervised the building and installation of the first set of 3 cells. A B-25 had been flown into the South Bend, Indiana Bendix Airport for the fuel cell fit check. The first radio crawlway meringue bladder cell was too big in its folded position to get through the rear hatch opening for installation. A replacement 160-gallon meringue cell, 1/3 the size, was built and installed in the radio crawlaway. A 225-gallon meringue self-sealing cell was installed in the top half of the bomb bay where 4 500-pound bombs had been removed. A 60-gallon meringue self-sealing cell was installed where the aft gun turret had been removed. The rest of the meringue cells were built by personnel, including myself, who were furnished around the clock food and lodging at the plant in order to meet the shipping deadline. Doolittle stopped at our plant several times to see that production was on schedule. All finished meringue cells were then shipped to Mid-Continent Airlines Depot at Minneapolis, Minnesota for immediate installation. On March 23rd, 1942, I flew to California to McClellan Field. It took 2 days in a DC-3 with an overnight stay at Reno, Nevada. I worked 6 days helping to finish the connecting of fuel hoses to the 60-gallon fuel tanks in 22 B-25 airplanes. One morning I had the opportunity to meet Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, who was in his dress pinks at his plane parked next to mine, working on his left wheel brake. The 7th morning there, I went to the airfield, and there wasn't a B-25 plane in sight. All 22 planes had been flown out, and no one knew where they had gone. When I heard about the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, I knew what those special cells in those secret B-25s were for. Thank you.
The Doolittle raid was a great morale boost for the Allies all around the world. It also endeared the B-25 to everyone for all time. But the B-26 was in place in the Pacific, and it had to answer for the Japanese and their highly touted Zero. Walter Krell didn't believe that the Zero was better than the B-26, and he set about to prove it.
A lot of our targets were jungle targets, and we didn't have the satisfaction of blowing up locomotives and warehouses and bridges and petroleum tanks and all the good stuff the guys had in Europe. We would see a Japanese strip down there and nothing else around it. Well, they were masters at camouflage, and they'd pull their stuff back in where we couldn't see it. So these kind of targets were not satisfactory and made us eventually resolve ourselves into thinking that we'll do some good if we can fight Zeros, if we can knock Zeros down, if we can get onto the Zeros' shortcomings and take advantage. And we think in a large part we may have done that. the Zeros at first would line up on either side of us. Now here we're flying at about 1,500 feet and make their frontal attacks, and then they figured out they were shooting at each other as they came in. So they quit that, and they'd start to line up on one side of it. We were pretty fast on a downhill go when we came off the target. We'd often put that airplane down well over 400 miles an hour. The airplane that the Japanese flew, the Zero, they failed to include, the best information I can get, the booster tab, which you well know is that little tab that operated in a reverse position from your control surface. So as you increase speed and you increase the pressure against your controls, that little booster tab with its mechanical linkage went in the opposite direction, and you had good control. And the B-26 was marvelous for that. At whatever speed we put it up to, we had good control. It was highly maneuverable, the ones we had anyhow. And the Japanese didn't have that feature, so at high speeds going downhill, anything over 300 miles an hour, we knew darn well that they couldn't come into us or surprise us anyway. They'd have to hit the deck with us and go along with us quite some distance away from their home base, incidentally, and as we approached ours, but ours was still miles away over the Owen Stanley Range. This is now along the northeast coast of New Guinea, and we're trying to shake these guys, and they're going to be with us for a good 45 minutes, and if we're all flying all right and everybody's happy and we got a good tight formation, we're a very formidable target, and since we're the defenders and the Japs in that instance are the attackers, they're being forced to come to us in our terms. And so this is a procedure that we came along with. I found out that if I could hold the formation extremely steady while this Zero pilot committed himself to a turn and continued to hold it until he was well into his turn, until I'd see his guns start firing. Now, our weapons were generally activated with a spring-loaded switch, either on the joystick or the wheel or whatever you had. Like on the B-25s with 8 forward-firing 50s. You had a press button that would snap back if you let it go and the guns would quit. The Japanese, on the left side of his cockpit, he had a lever that he would activate to start 2 20-millimeter cannons going in his wings. And they were not rapid-firing 20 millimeters, they were slow bumpers. But they put a lot of flame out in front of his wings that made you wonder where that stuff was going to go. Then on the fuselage, the nose, he had a couple of machine guns that were close to the equivalent, I'm told, of our .30 calibers. And those guns were activated with a button. So now get the picture of this poor guy sitting in a Zero. He's parked out there, and he's going to attack these B-26s, maybe just 3, maybe a total of 4. Now here's a flight crew that's been flying together almost a year. They can almost smell each other's bad breath from one airplane to another. They're that good. On my right wing is generally always Al Stanwood, the most dependable, reliable guy that you'd ever want. And on the left wing is Junior Hatch, too hot for his own good, but a hell of a good pilot. If we have a number 4 man with us on any given day, he's baggage. And there we are, tight, flying along. Now this poor Zero pilot has got to set himself up to attack us, and there may be 8 or 10 or 12 Zeros lined up, and the squadron commander's riding herd on him, and as I remember, he had a diagonal red stripe around his fuselage. And these guys, one at a time, mind you, would have to commit himself to our airplanes. So here was a technique. We'd hold very steady until this fellow had actually committed himself to the attack. He was now fully in his turn. Now his guns would start to fire, and it took a little teeth gritting to wait another several fractions of a second longer until he was now literally almost facing us. Now we do 3 things. We'd turn within his radius of turn, we'd lose elevation to pick up speed, and the guy would pull right over the top of us, and you watch his head wobbling around in there, almost saying to himself, where'd they go, where'd they go? And he'd go right by us over the top, giving a beautiful, beautiful shot, in most instances, to our turret gunners. And our turret gunners were very good. They had stops so they wouldn't shoot our props off. They could clip the end of our wings. They couldn't shoot our tail off, but they still, any target up above them and going by them, they had a pretty good go at, especially if they had a lead in. And our nose gunner, who only wound up with a little .30 caliber gun up there, had some pretty good licks at them too. And on the way by, the tail gunner would know that one was just on his way by, and he'd be on the alert to pour some more at him. This was a field day. Now, I'd straighten the whole formation up, and I would maybe be a little closer to all these zeros, so they may shift over a little bit to try to once again get in position for the next attack. And unfortunately for them, they came at us one at a time. The guys would fire the guns in such a way, intermittent bursts. They didn't overheat the guns and jam them for the most part. And we'd get back in pretty good shape. We'd had no cameras. We couldn't prove what we did or what we didn't do, but I think the Japanese confirmed later that we hurt them pretty bad.
When I was leaving the tent, Pappy Robinson said to me, "Foley, have you ever fired a gun?" I says, "No, I haven't even fired a BB gun." So they took me out in the back and they gave me a .45 automatic, and they told me to fire at a anthill, a great big anthill out there. I missed every single shot. I missed the anthill. Then they gave me a Tommy gun, and I fired the Tommy gun. I missed every single shot with the Tommy gun. And then they gave me a rifle, and I hit the anthill with the rifle, and he put down on my records qualified on a .45 automatic, qualified on a Tommy gun, and qualified on a rifle. So then I went down to Krell's airplane, and the next day we went out on a practice mission, and it was a beautiful blue sky. It was just so pretty with little puffy white clouds. And Krell gave me 200 rounds of ammunition, 100 rounds to each machine gun. And when we got up in the air, he called out these little puffy white clouds as zeros, and he'd say 0 at 11 o'clock, or 0 at 9 o'clock, 0 at 6 o'clock. And having tracer bullets, I would fire, and then Krell would watch how I fired and not make no comments. When I finished with all the ammunition that I had, we landed, and he shook hands with me at the back of the airplane and said I was his gunner. Well, as I said before, I had no schooling, and on my very first mission, I was credited with shooting down a Japanese fighter plane. There was a war correspondent by the name of Pat Robinson, and he wrote back home about the story about me shooting down this plane on my first mission, and he nicknamed me Johnny Zero. So then they wrote a song called Johnny Zero, and from that day on, I was known as Johnny Zero.
B-26s shot down a few German fighters also. West Lothian got credit for some, and Bill Norris even got 2 Me-262s. But we have cases of marauders going after bigger game. John Sharp will tell us about one of these.
In early January 1943, the 70th Bomb Squadron returned to Guadalcanal, this time for an extended tour. We were gaining air strength at Henderson Field, but the Japanese still held the rest of the island. On the 31st of January, Navy intelligence determined there was a large Japanese task force underway, and it had to be found. A late-night briefing, 10 Navy TBFs and 6 B-26s were assigned to search patterns. Our area was a 500-mile pie-shaped pattern north of Guadalcanal. We took off at 4 o'clock in the morning. It was extremely dark, climbed to 9,000 feet. And at daylight, we saw a small silhouette appear on the horizon at about 10 o'clock. As it grew larger, it was obvious we were on a collision course. This huge silhouette took shape, and we soon recognized it as a 4-engine flying boat, codenamed Mavis. We held course, and suddenly this giant airplane made a turn over us. and as it flew overhead, we were all tense like rubber bands. The turret gunner hit a burst, and boy, we jumped clear to the top of the ceiling. I immediately firewalled both engines and started a steep climb. As we leveled off on the right side, a long stream of white smoke on top of the fuselage indicated these high-speed guns of theirs in a power turret. So that put us into a steep dive, way down, leveled off, flew directly under the hull, raising like an elevator, let the turret just rake him over good. Then I want a little piece of this guy myself, so I pulled up and gave him a burst with my fixed guns, package guns, one on each side. They were homemade. Then into a violent breakaway and pull up on the right side again. By now, our bombardiers had a 50 caliber gun, but poor Al couldn't use it because as soon as he unhooked it, in these violent maneuvers, wherever that gun butt went, he went with it. The turret guns on the top were silent now, and we had an inboard engine on fire. This guy wasn't going to get away, and we very deliberately planned our next attack. Again, I went into a steep dive, leveled off under the hull, raised up so the turret could sew him up again. Then again, I pulled up, and this time emptied my fixed guns into him. And whammo, too late, we were hit by cannon fire, and the right wing started coming apart. No break this time. I told the crew I was leveling off and would hug this guy real close and pass underneath. I was trying to slow down now, and as we came out the front, the tail gunner finally got his chance at point blank, and he turned on his gun like a fire hose, and the giant Mavis was gone. I knew I was in trouble and was slowing down to keep the wing from tearing open. At 180, the tearing stopped, but the airplane was shaking and was mushing a little bit. I dropped quarter flaps. She leveled off and flew smoothly. I started descending toward a spotty cloud layer. Bombardier got rid of the bombs, and we settled down for a long flight home. Inside of Guadalcanal, I tested the airplane for stalling, and we had a definite roll-off stall to the right at 170. I told the Henderson Tower I would make an overhead approach at 5,000 feet. With gear and flaps down, I couldn't recognize the stall, so I came in very fast. I felt the roll-off just before touchdown, then hung on the brakes all the way to the end of the PSP, the plank runway. After we parked, our maintenance man said the main spar had been blown completely in two. Our sheet metal men and the CBs repaired the wing spar, replaced the leading edge, and we flew another mission the next morning.
Number 14 Squadron got the most chances to back German aircraft. Their trophies include single-engine fighter, two-engine bombers, 2, 3, and 4-engine transports, and even one 6-engine Gigant that Group Captain Madewell tells about.
And then on the next trip, on the 23rd of July, we were flying just near Bastia when we came across the Ju-90. And so we flew up alongside it and shot at it, and it disappeared towards Bastia itself, and there was a huge flame, and it blew up. And it was only 39 years later that we heard through the German authorities that it had been finished off by its own ack-ack. Now, on the 29th of July, we were in the same area, and we treated each mission now as though it was a sort of going out for a day's hunting, and we thought we might always come up against a 6-engine one, since we'd had a 3-engine one and a 4-engine one. Anyway, we were flying north of Corsica, and we saw this airplane coming towards us like a block of flats. And it was a Messerschmitt 323, flying at sea level, solo, with no escort. And so immediately we got in front of it, and my tail gunner, who's an exceptionally good shot, he knocked out 3 engines almost immediately. And the ME-323 staggered towards the shore and made a forced landing. It didn't catch on fire, and we have got some very interesting photographs of the German crew taking pictures of themselves so shortly after forced landing. And now, more than 50 years later, I'm still in touch with the pilot of that ME-323, whose name was Oberfeldwebel Walter Hoenig, that is to say, a warrant officer. And later, when the aircraft was in territory that we'd captured, I went with a friend with a hacksaw and cut off 7 prop tips. I kept 2 for myself and gave each member of my crew a prop tip. And 39 years later, I saw Walter Hoenig, and I presented him with a prop tip from his crashed aircraft. And now we are very good friends.
By the time the Marauder was used in the ETO, a radio system was in place for navigating in the lousy European weather. Tom Dolezal, former group radar officer of the 322nd, will talk about G and a bit about the history of radar in World War II. Tom Dolezal, former group radar officer of the 322nd, will talk about G, and we've talked about that again. You've repeated me here.
I would say that most of us here today probably never heard the word radar until we arrived in military service some 50 years ago. Now, radar, as we know now, was one of the major technological advances of World War II. It definitely changed the tactics and strategy of conducting aerial warfare, and in particular, aerial bombardment. It was the British who can probably lay claim to being the first to apply radar to a military operation. They began building their chain of radar stations along the east coast of England in 1935. This became their first line of defense against the incoming German aircraft. It was the first line of defense for RAF Fighter Command as well, because with the use of the radar and the controlling systems, aircraft could be scrambled at the right time and without the waste of a lot of time patrolling. So it did save an awful lot of pilot time and was very effective. However, not only did the ground radar begin, by 1941, we had airborne radars mounted in most of the various RAF commands, Bomber Command, Coastal Command, Fighter Command. And in Bomber Command, the RAF used what was called a G and an oboe radar set. They had others as well, but we in 9th Bomb Division used only 2 of these, the G and the oboe. Now, I'll only talk about G because the section following me will be about oboe. G was primarily a navigational radar, but on occasion had been used for blind bombing. We in the 322nd Bomb Group received the first 4 G-equipped aircraft in December 1943. The G system consisted of 3 ground transmitters, a special radar receiver and a cathode ray tube, and a special G map of Europe, which was overlaid with a series of hyperbolic curves. Now, how did it work? Fairly simply, 3 ground transmitters spaced about 100 miles apart, one being called the master, the other 2 being called slaves. The master transmitted, the slaves repeated, and the receiver in the aircraft picked up all 3 signals and measured them out on a time base. The navigator could lock these in, read their numerical value, and compare them with the numerical value as shown on his G map, the hyperbolic lines crossing various places. So in other words, by doing this, the navigator knew exactly where he was. It could also be used for such things as getting your drift, other little handy things. In practice, most navigators did, you flew a line, a G line that came over your target. You picked the other line that intersected it, and then you knew that was your target. Now you could reverse this and turn around for home base, which is probably handier still when you're coming back to know for sure that you're coming back to your own home. In fact, I received a letter about 2 years ago now from General Munch in which he described to me a situation that he had in which, coming back with about 52 aircraft on his wing, he was leading the mission. The ceiling dropped down to 500 feet, but his navigator, Benedict Sislow, picked up the line for home, got everybody going on the line. They all got home without further incident. Now that basically was what G did, navigation, on occasion blind bombing. Now let's go on to the second item of radar we had in the B-26s, and that was oboe.
G served very well for navigating during overcast conditions, but as Thomas said, it was not a device to use for actually dropping the bombs. RAF night bombers had been successfully hitting their targets using a system they call Pathfinder. The 9th began using this system during the day, with groups dropping their bombs on the bomb fall of a lead Pathfinder plane.
Pathfinder was kind of a baby of General Anderson's, and the orders were to handpick not only the flying crews, but all of the personnel, because we were to be only leaders in bad weather, which made it more difficult.
We use the same ground-controlled radar net that was used by the RAF at night.
Oboe was a code name, a musical instrument, that equipment, and it functioned differently when you were leading missions, when you were bombing, that we had to use that equipment instead of the Northern bomb site.
After World War I beg your pardon, the English and the French and the Americans paid for it. They mapped all of Europe and England perfectly, and you could make an actual measurement on a map, and the error would be less than 1 foot in the ground, even across the channel in all of the European continent.
But it consisted basically of 2 radio stations on the ground which were mobile, truck mounted.
They would measure your distance from a ground point on an arc that went through the target, and they'd keep track of your position on that arc from another ground point, and during the last minute of the bomb run, they would measure your speed within 1/100th of a mile an hour and calculate your drop and transmit it to you.
The equipment was contained in our rear bomb bay. They took all the stuff out of the rear bomb bay, and facing forward in the ship, the whole right side was full of MIT black boxes. And the left side had an aerial that was about 5.5 feet long, and it was cased in a cylinder that was about 12 inches in diameter, and it was on a hydraulic elevator. And when we get ready to turn on to our bomb run, we would lower this antenna down below the ship.
We supposedly had a 2-minute over target, plus or minus 2 minutes. And we were supposed to bring the pilot in to put him on course within 10 degrees of the actual bomb run course. I always tried to come in within 5 degrees for him. That made it a little easier for him.
On the inside of this circle in the air, we had a dit, and on the outside we had a da, and where they merged, we had a tone.
You got in closer than your bomb run to the station, while you got dit, dit, dit in this ear, and if you got below the bomb run, you got dit, dit, dit in this ear. If you got too far out, you got da, da, da in this ear. If you got too high up, you got da, da, da in this ear. So you'd keep on balancing all those sounds coming into your earphones until you got a steady da.
Also, a ground station gave the signal for the bomb release.
And the man that was in charge of sending the release signal, he'd send you an A, and then a B, and then a C, and then a D. All signals would cease when he'd send those to let you know where you were. And a D was when you opened your bomb bays. And you flew with your bomb bays closed all the time until you reached the D point, which was about 90 seconds 4 bombs away. And then you also had a bunch of lights on your panel down there, and they'd light up so you wouldn't forget whether you passed A or B or C or D.
Then after D, why, it was a red light, which meant the rest were green. That was a red light that you're ready for bombs away. And then shortly before bombs away, the signal would start increasing in intensity, and it'd go, whoa, get higher and higher for about 20 seconds, and then it'd shut off. And when it shut off, all the lights went out your panel, and that's when the bombardier hit the salvo.
It was the top secret of the war at that point.
In fact, they told us that if we were shot down or fell in the hands of the Germans, if they knew we were pathfinders, we would probably be tortured.
That was the one part I wasn't too happy about, was getting up every morning and flying out to the groups, ready to go in case the weather was bad. And if it was too bad to go, then we had to fly home too. So it made for a lot of, I never forget flying out to one of these fields and all was dark, and then finally you'd see the little string of lights that come on and flare up. You can just hear the putt-putt, and the lights come up and then they go down and die, and then they come up and they go down and die. Finally it'd come up and bounce, and then they'd stay on, and you could go around land.
Being based separately, supposed to be supplied by British quartermaster, where they said we were getting lamb and everyone was buying like a goat, and when you can't get it past your nose anymore, you can go hungry easier. So really, we love to go to the various groups and get there early to see if we could find something to eat.
We'd have to fly out to these satellite fields around to the other wings, and you can imagine how happy they were to see this strange pilot coming in here, probably with a 2 days beard and maybe covered with mud from conditions he's living in, and he stands up on the stage and tells you where he's going to take you, and then you go out and you follow him on a mission. That didn't sit too well in the very beginning, but they soon found out that we usually went in bad weather, and we knew how to get around the flak because they gave us enough instrumentation. We had a G-box in addition to the oboe, and we had good maps for the flak, and people found that the Pathfinder mission was usually a pretty happy mission with a lot of cloud under you and hardly any flak.
And we lost more pilots to weather than we lost to combat losses.
I flew my last mission on December 18th, 1944, and we hadn't lost any airplanes in the Pathfinder squadron, and the next mission was the 23rd of December, and we lost 3 in the Pathfinders, 39 total in all the wings. So it was a tough day.
Well, far away from the dots and the da-das and the bar-bars, back at the works, they were worrying about quality control. And a gentleman that we have here today was a quality control inspector at Glen Martin, Harry Metty. Harry.
That's why I'm not a pilot. The word quality control was really a post-war word or definition, like 0 defects, mission success, and so forth. But when I was hired 55 years ago by the Glen Martin Company, it was known as inspection. I was hired as a detail inspector because I learned how to read blueprints, aircraft blueprints. As a young kid out of high school, I went in and I started work on the French job, the 167, and the British job, 187. But over in a restricted area, there was a plane being built, assembled, and on the rollout in November 1940, this beautiful streamlined thing looked like a cigar, was B-26, first of the famous B-26s. The Army wanted 35 a month, and to reach that goal, we had to build another building about a half a mile from there that was erected, and I think many of you, I pointed that out to you in Baltimore in 1991 when you had your last reunion. The building was built, and my boss came over to me about a month later, put his hand on my shoulder, really up this high, and he said, "Harry, we'd like you to go to Plant 2 on the midnight to 8 o'clock shift." And I said, "Okay." I said, I don't question at that age what to do. He said, "I'd like you to go down there and you're going to be a working supervisor." And what's a working supervisor? He said, "Well, we got manpower, we got to get 35 a month. You have to work, and then when someone asks you a question, you supervise. But they did give me an increase of a nickel an hour, 2.5-cent bonus for night shift, 2.5 cents for being the supervisor. 50 cents an hour was big money then. So I worked there, and when we had the, about 4 months later, we were getting into the high rate of production, or starting the tooling and all. So my boss said, Harry, how about working Saturdays? Okay, I'll work Saturdays. 2 months later, he said, Harry, how about working Sundays? And I said, okay. So 13 months later, I asked him, could I have a day off? And he said, what, a day? He said, what are you going to do in a day? Just think about coming back to work. I said, I'd like to have Christmas off one day. So I did after 13 months. But you know something? The manufacturing employees really made the quality or the inspection easy. They were so dedicated to doing the job right the first time, they had very few rejections. They really deserve a lot of credit. Every part was inspected individually. There was no 1 out of 100 or analytical analysis or whatever you do. All the over 160 million detailed parts we checked, and for all those Marauders. Every part went through there, and every procedure we did was monitored by the Air Corps inspectors. They checked everything we did from details through delivery. One of the people there I brought along from that Air Corps group was Secretary of the Commanding Officer from delivery of the first B-26 to tail end Charlie. I'd like to introduce my wife, Cass. And I'd like to say this, being on the Marauder team that provided you with the best bomber of World War II and brought you home safely was a major part of my life.
Originally turned down for a pilot's license because of poor eyesight, Jimmy Fox put in over 500 hours working with Martin. Jimmy.
I joined the Martin Company in 1942 as a ground school instructor in the B-26 training school, which was just across the road from the airport and part of the Plant 2 facility. I didn't have any aviation experience. In those days, a lot of other people didn't have any aviation experience also. I had been a telegraph operator since the age of 15, working for a railroad company. I'd been a station agent, train dispatcher, and best of all, I had been a telephone and telegraph lineman, signal maintainer for a number of years. This got me assigned to teach the electrical system of the B-26. The electrical system of the B-26 was mounted on a T-shaped table platform about waist high. Every piece, every switch, every light bulb, every unit was installed, and just exactly as it was in the airplane. That includes the pedestal and the instrument panel. The school also had a couple of airplanes that were used for heavier type of mechanical training, such as engine change, wheel replacement, brake replacement, control surface replacement, etc. The other of the two airplanes had live engines, and we used that for pre-flight inspection and for engine startup and engine run-up and test procedures. After several months of this, I was able to transfer into the flight test department as a flight engineer co-pilot. The department was managed by Pat Tibbs, some of you knew him, who was the chief pilot. At this point in time, the B-26 production was moving along pretty rapidly. 5 airplanes a day were coming off the line, and each airplane was given a 2.5-hour flight test. And it went pretty well. Seldom did an airplane have to be flown twice. Some of the things I recall along the way were my first assignment to this airplane in this capacity. As a flight engineer co-pilot, I was required to do the pre-flight inspection, to ride in the airplane in the right seat, assist in the operation and testing of all the equipment, record the performance data, and just generally take care of the paperwork. Once in a little while, I'd get a little flying time. During the several years that I did this work on the B-26, there were a few things I might mention. The one thing has been talked about here for over and over, and that is the pilots who flew the airplane, the initial pilots. In many cases, the young pilots who would come to the field were younger than I, and many of them had 120, 130 hours of flying time maybe, and maybe a little time in a Bamboo bomber, and in many cases, so I was told, once or twice around the field in the B-26. And they did themselves proudly. The other incidents that I do recall, there were a couple of 3 airplanes were lost during flight test. One, before I began to work for the company, I believe was the case of an interrupter, gun interrupter not being in the right position, and the tail was shot off. Secondly, we had one loss of airplane due to structural failure in the case of a left flap separating from the airplane. This created a control problem, and of course the crew bailed out. There was one other incident of this sort that I recall, and that had to do with the propeller system. The engines were shut down during this flight test and restarted again, and in this case, when the propeller was feathered, the blades didn't stop at the 88-degree feather position. They continued on around, and that put the propeller in a so-called reverse pitch position. Again, a control problem developed and the crew bailed out. I believe there were 5,119 B-26s built, of which 3,500 were built in Baltimore. The balance were built in Omaha, and they were the C models. Engineering-wise, 2 projects I participated in, and one was the use of a JM-1 airplane, which was the Navy version of the B-26, as a flying test bed for the Westinghouse jet engines. The first engine was the 19B, a small engine, 1,350 pounds thrust. It was mounted in the rear end of the fuselage, and the exhaust stack of the engine was right out through the tail cone. A little bit later, along came a bigger engine, the 24C. It was a 4,000-pound thrust engine, and it couldn't fit in the fuselage, so it was mounted in a pod and carried on the left side of the fuselage back toward the tail. I am told that this 4,000-pound thrust engine would fly the B-26 past the C-47 with both propellers feathered. That was a long time ago, but don't quote me. Now I'll tell you about the most unusual B-26 that was ever built, and that was the G model, the H model, B-26H, of which only one was built. That was the next to last production airplane. And that airplane was used to develop the bicycle-type landing gear, which was being used on the Martin B-48 and the B-51, and which, as you know, was also used on the Boeing B-47s and B-48s. Now, tail end Charlie came along after that. Now, my script has one more line for me to say, but before I say that one line, I want to make a personal observation. This great airplane, this B-26, opened the door for me to a 52-year flying career, which ended in January of '92 when I retired from Pan American World Airways. My small contribution in this big project, which so many great people designed and built this airplane, and in particular to you folks who flew the thing with such skill and determination during combat. Now back to my last line. The stump jumper, which is what the B-26H was called, made about 15 or so test flights at the Martin plant, and it was then flown to Wright-Patterson for further testing.
I had one other relationship with the B-26. When I got back, I went to Wright Field as a test pilot in the bomber section, and one of the projects I did was to do the Air Force testing on the Middle River stump jumper, and I'm sure you've all seen pictures of it in the B-26 deal. I checked out 14 guys on that, and it was as advertised. The really bad thing about it was the nose wheel steering, which they changed later, but you can't believe. And I met the guy back at Baltimore that designed that, and he was so proud of it. And what it was, if you depress a rudder pedal a little bit, the wheel starts turning. The main wheel would start turning and continue turning. There was no such thing as holding it. You let up on the pressure, it goes back to zero. If you want a little bit of a turn, you have to do this way. And the brake, he got the idea from a hayrick. I always call it a hayrick brake, and he told me he got the idea. A great big lever coming out of the floor with a ratchet on it, and this is how you put on the brakes, and both of them at one time. But it was a stable landing gear, and we gave it a go sign for the B-48 and B-47. And I only had one bad minute. You get a bunch of strange guys that weren't B-26 pilots to check out in it. You didn't give them a full check. I just let them steer it around and land and take off. If you remember, the elevator trim is on the side of the console, and it's got nice white marks for each degree, and it has 5 degrees and 10 degrees, and it has a 0 in the middle. Well, we took off the ground one day, and of course I'm sitting on the right, and peer around here, 0 trim, and we took off, and God, the airplane just was going up like, ended up with both the guy that's getting checked out and me both stiff on the wheel to hold the nose from going over the top. I got around there and got the trim down. The 10 on the nose down 10, or nose up 10, looks just like the 0 with another mark. So if you ever get a chance to fly another B-26, be sure it's not 10 degrees nose up trim instead of 0.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break there for the obvious reasons. You have 15 minutes to do what you want to do, but be back for our finale. I should tell you that buses will leave here at regular intervals to take you back, so don't fret about that. But be back here at 5 minutes to 3 for the exciting finale. Thank you.